Capital tonight. I'm Tim Boyum. As our biggest city, there's always a hot topic in Charlotte. For a look at some of these top talkers and more, we have friends of the program, Tarek Bakari and Larkin Eggleston. They're both members of the Southern Group and former Charlotte City Council members, as well as R&D in the NC podcast. Guys, good to see you. Thank you so much. Speaking of the podcast, we were joking last night. You guys are younger than me, but you sound like old men on the podcast, raging about e-bikes and safety and scooters. What's going on here, Tarek?
Yeah, well, some weeks, every week we have a big episode discussion topic on the pod. Some weeks it's a no-brainer what it is. Some weeks there's a little lull and we get to decide to pick a policy topic that we think deserves a little airtime. And we decided e-bikes, scooters, and kids, particularly under the age of 16, it's a case where technology is far exceeding what government and regulation is able to address. And there is just a huge safety concern among families, among mom groups on social media, among neighborhoods of these kids who are going 25, 30, 35 miles an hour, popping wheelies in 4-lane traffic. And Larkin's usually the only big government guy. He couldn't be bothered to wear a jacket today. But I had some feelings myself having a 12-year-old who has a biker gang of his own, of his buddies, and they're using these things. And it's dangerous, and a conversation and some common sense regulation needs to be put in place.
All right, just for the record, we do not have a clothing requirement for this program. Also, Larkin has pollen coating his throat, so if you hear his voice a little scratchy, that's the case today. Larkin, I mean, is there a way to regulate this? Should there be? Or is this a lesson in schools? What do you think?
Yeah, I thought pollen should be the topic this week, as you can hear from my voice. We've got to cover it one of these days. No, what we kind of talked about on this episode is there's two ways. Yes, we can put some guardrails up here. Government can. I think there's two ways that happens, and there's one that we would prefer than the other, and that's either public pressure that says we identify this as a challenge, as a risk, and something that's kind of a ticking time bomb, or it's tragedy, and God forbid we see a child die on one of these with some of the behavior that we're seeing. That's not that unrealistic, and I think that would yield regulation, but we'd rather try to get ahead of that so we avoid those types of tragedies by saying this is a problem. It doesn't mean we ban them, it doesn't mean we take them away, but we ought to be able to have some guardrails around licensing or age requirements or speed requirements, things of that nature.
Well, and Tarek, what about, just last night, ironically, we were talking about this when I drove home, there was a guy on an e-bike screaming down the sidewalk. I mean, should we have kind of an idea of where these, not every town has bike lanes where you could put these, for instance. I mean, should we allow these motorized bikes on sidewalks, for instance, where people are walking and running, me slower than others, but anyway, should we?
Yeah, my partner RFK Jr. and I were talking about that on the podcast as well. We came up with 4 kind of buckets as a framework that we proposed local governments and leaders talk about. One is you got to classify these things, and there's under 15 miles an hour, there's 25, there's ones that go 50, 55, 60 miles an hour. So having a common taxonomy is important. 2 is deciding where these things can go. To your point, is sidewalk the safe place, or does that put pedestrians in danger? There's not bike lanes everywhere. 4-lane roads obviously don't make a lot of sense. And then the third being, what age is okay? Is 12 or 13 years old okay to be on something that can go 22, 25 miles an hour on the street? And then finally, enforcement, right? Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to enforce? Because laws are only as good as how they can be enforced. So there's no simple answer, but it's important enough for our leaders, I think, to pay attention to.
I remember when the scooters were first coming out, and the whole argument was about them laying around all over town and whatnot.
Well, they're still doing that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Well, and the scooters, if that's what people are thinking about, a lot of the bikes that we're seeing this dangerous behavior on are much closer to a motorcycle than they are to an e-scooter. And so that, again, that common terminology I think is important, because there's a whole range of products now that have some similarities, but some are much closer to a motorized vehicle than the Lime and Bird scooters that we were dealing with on City Council in 2018.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody's favorite subject across the state, but especially in Charlotte, HB2. 10 years this week, believe it or not. Tarek, does that still, the leftovers of that still reverberate, or is that long in the past?
No, Larkin and I were talking about this earlier, and I think he made a great point, which is
Wait, let's stop there. Did you hear that, Larkin? He said he made a great
I
point.
did. I
Okay.
can't believe he's about to give me credit for this.
What Larkin said to me was, Tark, guess what? This thing is so unbelievable. So I had to translate it, but the punchline was the topic, not so much. If you're talking about the bathrooms and things like that, we don't really hear a lot of that right now anymore. I think the nation has evolved beyond that point, and some could say for better or for worse. I think the point is it's not that flashpoint moment that it was, but the thing that does linger is, and was kind of the starting point back then, was this great state of Mecklenburg, the really contentious divide between Raleigh and Charlotte. And you see that in hesitancy to engage and kind of how people interact with each other and the lack of partnership. And it still, I think, lingers as it relates to people who they believe was at fault. Was it the governor and the legislature, or was it the mayor, Jennifer Roberts, at the time, and the council who went out on a limb? I think there's some unresolved blame from that perspective, but more importantly, it's just the dynamic.
Larkin, last comment on this because we got to go, but is there lingering from that impact? And does a potential new Senate President pro tem from that region, does that help this move forward, just the relationship?
I think it certainly can, but I do think there's a little bit of PTSD from that time period, and I think it's a thing that still gets referenced when people start to look at doing things locally that they may not have the explicit authority to do, and you start to be a little bit more mindful of measuring that risk-reward scenario in making those decisions, because we now have an example that we all lived through of where that can really blow up in your face even if you're doing something you think is the right thing to do.